Hey everyone, this is Nico E from the Sunshine Foundation, and in this video we're going to look at how to use smart items using the advanced mode. So in previous videos we saw how we can just drag in an item, for example this door, and if we were to run our scene now, we can just click on the door and it will just work. We can also configure the door. For example, we can remove the default behavior that it opens when you click on it, just like that. And I can also, for example, add a button, for example this button here. And I can configure this button so that when the button is clicked, I can look for my door and open it. That's fairly straightforward, that's pretty easy to set up, and in many cases that's really all you need to do. In many cases that's more than enough for building the kinds of game mechanics and rules that you want. But now we're going to look into how you can build something that is way more customized. So just for reference, if I click on the button now, the door opens, and that is pretty good as it is. But now let's look at how we can dive in deeper to build much more customized mechanics. So if I'm with the button selected, this, as you can see, is the simple view. But if we go down here, we can enable the advanced mode. And now you will see that there is plenty more. There are a lot more fields to configure, but don't fret, this is not as complicated as it might look at a first glance. So I'm going to first close all of these components. I'm going to minimize them just so that you have a view of what the components are on this item. So most items, like for example this chunk of wall, have a transform and a GLTF component. Transform basically tells you where this appears, the rotation, the scale, whilst the GLTF tells you what 3D model to render in this position. It's a GLV file with its full path. Now the button smart item has the two same things. The transform tells it where it appears, and the GLTF that tells us what 3D model to display in that position. But then we have more interesting things. We have an action and a trigger component. And now we're going to dive into what these do. These are the most interesting chunks of all of this. The animator controls the animation you see on the button, this pressing action. We don't need to really analyze this any further. Then there's the multiplayer component that basically tells you how the actions of this item are going to be viewed by other players. So in this case, since the animator component and the audio source component are checked, this means that other players will also see the animations and the sounds of whatever happens to this button. If I click these, then each player will have a completely separate experience of when the button emits any sounds or runs an animation. But we are also not gonna make any changes here. We're gonna instead dive into the action and the trigger, which are the really interesting ones. So the action component tells you what things this item is capable of doing. In this case, there are two actions being defined here, and I can add more actions if I want. I can add as many actions as I want here. But by default, we have two actions. One that is of type play animation, which basically plays the animation that you see on the button, get it pressed. And the other one is of type play sound, which plays a sound file. In this case, it's a sound.mp3 file. And you can also set, each kind of animation has a different set of properties. For example, here you can set the volume, and other kinds of actions have other properties which are relevant to that action. Basically, the action component in the button tells you what things the button is capable of doing. It doesn't tell you when these things are carried out, and that is the job of the trigger component. The trigger component tells you when an action from the action component will happen. In this case, so trigger component lists trigger events, and in this case there's a single trigger event which happens on input action, meaning when you click on the button. And let's expand this so that it's a bit easier to read. You'll see that there are three actions being called whenever the trigger event is activated. So first two of these happen within the same item. So they are these two actions you see here, the play active animation and the play sound, both belonging to the red light button, which is the item that we're currently looking at. And the third one is one that we configured while we were inside the basic view, which calls the wooden door and tells us to run the open action. So that's really all there is to it. There's actions, which list the things that can happen, and there's triggers, which are events that trigger some actions into happenings. These actions can either be within the same item or they can be within other items. So an interesting thing that you also get with the advanced view is you can add conditions. So in this case, if we click here and we do add trigger condition, we can make it so that these things only really happen whenever a certain condition is met, not always. So for example, let's make this a little bit more interesting. Let's add this sci-fi lever here. Let's pretend that this is a power switch and that this electric door won't really work unless the power is up. Let's rotate this 180 so that it faces us. And so whenever you pull on this lever, you will be activating the power, but without the power active, the door will simply not work. So we're not really going to do anything with the lever, but we're going to use the lever as part of our conditions. So we come back to this trigger event, we will add a condition, and in this case our condition would be that the sci-fi lever, the state, is activated. So if the state is not activated, none of these actions will happen. If the state is activated, then we will carry out these actions. Let's take a look at that. Great, so if I now try to click on the button, you'll see that nothing happens until I pull on the lever, and now the door will properly work. Great. I didn't really like the experience of not getting any kind of feedback when I click on the button, so let's fix that. Let's add a brand new action, and let's add a display text action. So you'll see that there's a whole lot of options, and we're not going to go over all of them now because there's a lot of different things you can do, ranging from adding something to the player's hand to teleporting the player, to making the player play an animation, making a tween so that something moves. So in this case, what I'm looking for is that show text. This is it. And let's just give this a name so that it's easy to reference. And the text that we want to show is power is down. And we can also configure a couple of other things about this, like how long we want this text to appear on screen. The font size, in this case, let's make it big and visible. Let's make it a 30. And instead of being in the center of the screen, let's make it so that it's on the bottom center. Now, as we said before, the actions component defines what things can be done, but now we have to actually tell that thing to happen. And the way we do this is by adding a new trigger event, because we want this to happen in the opposite condition, whenever the sci-fi lever is not activated. So in order to do that, we'll have to create a new trigger event, which looks just like the other one with an on-input action. And in this case, when this happens, we want to call the red light button and call the show text action. But we don't want this to happen every single time we click. We want this to happen only when the lever is not activated. So again, we will add a trigger condition, and we will reference our sci-fi lever and when state is deactivated. So with that, we should now have our scene prompting us whenever the power is not active, just to give us a hint, and so that we make sure that we do pull the lever. So now notice that there is text on the bottom of my screen saying power is down. This appears for 5 seconds and then it's gone. And if instead I pull the lever and press the button again, it should work. Now, I don't like that the door will, open again if I click on the button again. That doesn't look natural. So one solution to that would be to, instead of calling the open action, I can call the open or close action, and that would just toggle in between opening and closing. But one other way I can maybe fix this is by adding a second condition. I can add as many trigger conditions as I want. So for example, here I can add a second trigger condition that makes sure that the wooden door is in a state of closed. That way I don't open the door when it was already open. And by the way, as soon as I add more than one trigger condition, you'll notice that this new field appears, and this lets me select between 2 different ways to deal with these rules. There's the all conditions should meet, which is the default, meaning that every single one of these conditions that I add here needs to happen in order for these actions to be carried out. Or you can choose alternatively the any condition can be met or condition or rule, which means that if either one of these conditions is true, then that's good enough and these actions will happen whatever the other conditions result in. But in this case, I want all of the conditions to be true. So with this, I should be able to, once again, try out my scene and see that the door only opens once and doesn't open a second time. So now the door first will tell me that the power is down. Now if I pull the lever, I'm able to open the door, but if I try to open the door a second time, nothing will happen. Great. There's of course other ways I can deal with this. I could, for example, change the stuff in the door itself. So the door, again, is a simplified smart item that just offers me a door component with just the basic fields, but I can also go into the advanced mode for the door and configure a bunch of different things as well. You'll see that the door has, just like the button, an action and a trigger component, but also has a states component. This is a new thing. So this tells me that the door can be in one of these different states at any given time. It can either be open, close, or in a toggle state, which it's a bit of a trick that lets me open or close the door with the same action. I can also add new states. For example, I could add a power down state to the door, or locked state, or whatever I want. And then if I build different rules around these states, I can, make these have a meaning inside my game logic. It also has a pointer events component. This basically just tells me, for example, what hover text to see. When I point at the door, I see some text, and this lets me change that text. I can also, change the maximum click distance and all of these things, which at this point in time are not relevant to me because I disabled the clicking of the door as a possible action. But if the door was clickable, then this component would be pretty useful to set it up. And there's a multiplayer component, as we saw before. So if I go into the actions component, you'll see that there are a couple of actions that have to do with setting the state. So there's a set state action that sets it to open, one that sets it to close, and the other one that sets it to toggle. And just like in the buttons, we have a play sound action, which lets me play a sound, and a couple of animations that let me play the animation for opening the door and the animation for closing the door. If we look at the door's trigger component, you'll see that it's a bit different from the button. So here we have an on-input action that does nothing, and that's because we disabled that when we were in the basic view. Every change that we make while in the basic view gets reflected in the advanced view, not vice versa, by the way. But you will see that the door handles everything internally. So whenever the state of the door changes and the new state of the door is open, then we carry out the animation for opening the door as well as playing the sound. And on the other hand, whenever the state of the door changes and the new state of the door is closed, again, we play the animation for closing and the corresponding sound. So with that, we are in a way only making it necessary to carry out one action on the door. So when you look at the button and how we're calling the door from the button, you'll see that we're calling just the open action on the door. And if you look at the door's actions, you'll see that the open action is just setting the state to open. So we never are, from the button, we're never calling the door's play animation action. We're never calling the door's play sound action. That's all happening internally. The door knows what needs to happen whenever the door's state is changed, and so it handles that on its own. It knows what it needs to do. And that makes it a lot easier to interact with the door. You just need to tell the door to open from wherever in the scene you're calling the door, and the door just knows what it needs to do. For my final trick, let's do something that is a bit more out there. So instead of adding a smart item and configuring it, let's build something from scratch. Let's grab this boring old stone. This is decidedly not a smart item at all. This is just a stone, has a transform and a GLTF component, but we can give it any component we want. Just like a smart item, it can have actions, triggers, states, all of the stuff that you've seen in smart items is all available in any item you want. So in this case, let's add a new action. Let's call this action teleport, and there's a type of action called move player here. We look for that. Move player here, there we go. And now let's just add a new button, a more magical looking button than the other one. And from this button, when clicked, let's make it so that we look at the Rune Magic Stone item, which is what I just added, and call the teleport action. So with this, now I can just teleport inside the building. I don't need to, turn on the power and all of the stuff that I did before. So now, just like that, I can jump right inside the building. And I did it with an item that was not smart at all, but I made it smart by adding some interesting components to it. So that's all I wanted to share with you today. I hope you found this fun, and I can't wait to see what crazy creative ways you find to make use of all these tools. Thanks for watching.